A young mother went out to celebrate New Year's Eve and vanished. Police began an investigation and found several disturbing clues, but they couldn't uncover the truth. Only 35 years later did the case see a long-awaited breakthrough, and everyone finally learned what happened to her on that fateful New Year's night. Tanya McKinley was born on January 25, 1961, in the small American town of Milton, Florida. She grew up in a loving family and was very close to her older sister. The girls loved hanging out, riding skateboards, and going to the local bowling alley. After high school, Tanya decided to move to a larger city called Pensacola, which was about 25 miles from her home. She wanted to try her hand at the medical field and chose one of the quickest paths to a profession, a medical transcriptionist. To get a job like this, no medical degree was required. It was enough to complete special courses. Her cousin Vanita decided to move with her, and the young women rented an apartment together to save on rent. Shortly after moving, Tanya met a guy named Tim, and they started dating. Sometime later, the couple moved in together, and in 1983, their son Timothy was born. Tanya was happy to be a mother, but her relationship with Tim was far from perfect. They argued often, and about a year after their child's birth, the couple decided to break up. Towards the end of 1984, Tanya temporarily moved in with her cousin, who by that time already had a husband and 2 children. She planned to find a suitable place of her own and move out as soon as she had the opportunity. On December 31st, Tanya, along with Vanita and her husband, decided to celebrate the New Year at a local bar that was hosting a holiday event. In the evening, they dropped the kids off at a special daycare that stayed open late and went out to celebrate. That evening, the group was having a great time. They were laughing, dancing, and chatting. There were also many of their mutual acquaintances at the bar. When midnight struck and they welcomed 1985, Vanita and her husband started getting ready to go home. The daycare where they had left the children closed at 1 a.m., so they needed to pick them up before it closed. However, Tanya wanted to stay at the bar longer, given that virtually all her time was spent on work and caring for her son. This was her only chance to relax in the last 2 years, and she didn't want to miss it. Tanya asked her cousin to pick up her son from the daycare, and she agreed. Since they were living together and Vanita had to pick up her own kids anyway, it wasn't any trouble. Finally, Vanita asked her cousin how she planned to get home, since they had come to the bar in their car. But Tanya said she would have no problem finding a ride, as there were many familiar faces in the bar. On the morning of January 1st, Vanita woke up and, to her surprise, didn't find Tanya at home. This was strange, as she should have been back from the bar long ago. Nevertheless, her cousin assumed she might have gone to a friend's house and stayed over, so at first she didn't worry too much. But soon, everything changed. Vanita's mother-in-law came to their home, distressed, to deliver the distressing news. Tanya had been found, and she was no longer alive. That night, around 3 a.m., a Pensacola resident and her daughter were driving to an animal hospital because their dog was having a medical emergency. However, just as the woman pulled away from her house, her daughter noticed something strange on the side of the road. She thought it looked like a mannequin and told her mother. The woman decided to get a closer look and, to her horror, realized it was the young woman. She immediately returned home and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and found the body of a young woman. She was lying in an empty lot near the road. Her clothing was in disarray. Furthermore, she was missing her shoes. Near the victim, they also found a blue towel with red stains. Police quickly identified the victim as 23-year-old Tonya McKinley. A few streets away, they found her shoes and her purse, which contained her identification. The remains were sent to the medical examiners, while investigators processed the scene. They quickly determined that the victim had likely lost her life elsewhere. There were no significant stains near her remains, aside from the stains on the towel. There were drag marks on the ground indicating she had been pulled from the road to the side. On the towel and on the victim, police found their first potential leads. There were several reddish hairs as well as several body hairs and dog fur. They theorized that the first 2 samples belonged to the perpetrator, who might also own a dog. Medical examiners determined that Tanya had received a heavy blow to the head, but the cause of passing was strangulation. They also confirmed that the victim had been subjected to an assault. Experts recovered a biological sample from the perpetrator, but in those years, DNA analysis was not yet widely used in forensics. Therefore, all they could determine was that the suspect had type A blood. Given that these clues couldn't lead detectives to the perpetrator, They began compiling a list of possible suspects. First, they focused on Tim, the victim's ex-boyfriend. After speaking with relatives, they learned about their troubled relationship. They argued constantly, both before and after their son was born. When Tanya decided to end the relationship, Tim was against it. He didn't want to break up and kept trying to change her mind. He would call Tanya constantly, show up at her place, and generally behaved as if he couldn't accept the breakup. Investigators theorized that on New Year's Eve, Tim might have followed her to the bar, leading to an argument that ended in tragedy. They brought him in for questioning, but he denied any involvement. Tim also agreed to provide samples of his hair. Although experts couldn't extract DNA, they could compare the hairs under a microscope, which would be enough to establish similarity. However, Tim's hair was very different from what was found on the victim's remains in the towel, so he was temporarily cleared as a suspect. Next, detectives began checking all the patrons who were at the bar on New Year's Eve. They asked Vanita if there was anyone who behaved strangely or aggressively towards Tanya, but she stated the evening was uneventful and everything seemed normal. However, police learned that after breaking up with Tim, Tanya had briefly dated a man named Kurt, who was a bartender at the very establishment where she celebrated New Year's, and he was working that night. They spoke with him, but he denied any involvement. According to Kurt, after his shift ended, he went to a New Year's party with friends. Investigators interviewed his friends, and here they made a very interesting discovery. They confirmed that Kurt was indeed at the party, but he didn't show up immediately after his shift at the bar. Putting all the testimonies together, police concluded that in theory, the man had enough time to commit the crime. From interviewing bar patrons, detectives determined that Tanya was last seen alive at 1:15 a.m. However, no one saw her leave the bar. Additionally, police interviewed residents in the neighborhood where the remains was found. One family reported driving past that exact spot at around 2 a.m., and there was no body there. Thus, investigators established that the young woman lost her life in a window of just over an hour and a half from when she was last seen alive. And for that exact time, Kurt had no alibi. He was offered a polygraph test, and he agreed. The results were inconclusive. The operator concluded that some of his answers were deceptive. However, the lab results soon came back. They had taken a blood sample from the man and determined his blood type did not match the perpetrator, which was identified from the biological sample. Kurt was crossed off the suspect list. Police continued to search for other individuals who could have committed this crime, but their efforts led nowhere. They couldn't analyze the perpetrator's sample. They had no other significant evidence or witnesses, and the case quickly went cold. The one thing investigators were almost certain of was that the perpetrator must have lived in the area where the body was found. The location was remote, away from main roads, and on the very edge of a large residential area. Police doubted that a perpetrator unfamiliar with the area would drive there with the victims in the car, having no idea where they would end up. In the end, the case stalled for many years. Timothy, who was only 18 months old at the time of his mother's passing, was raised by his father with the support of Tanya's family. They all decided to hide the truth from the child about what had really happened to his mom. When he grew up, his relatives told him that Tanya had passed away in a car accident. This continued until he turned 14. Christmas was approaching, and the boy wanted to find out what gift his father had prepared for him. He snuck into his father's closet and started digging through the contents. But instead of a present, Timothy found something far more chilling. There was a letter written by his father, addressed to the popular TV host Montel Williams. In the letter, the man asked him to mention Tanya's unsolved case, hoping the media attention would help it progress. Tim described all the known details, and it was from this letter that his son learned what truly happened to his mom. In the early 2000s, the local police department reopened Tanya's case. They hoped that new DNA analysis tools would help them find the perpetrator, so investigators sent all existing evidence to the lab. Experts examined it and concluded that the stains on the blue towel found near the young woman did not belong to Tanya, but to an unknown male. They obtained his DNA profile and entered it into the FBI database, but there were no matches. Since then, the case went cold again, until it was reopened in 2015, exactly 30 years after the event. The perpetrator DNA still hadn't appeared in the FBI database, and detectives decided to try a different approach. Modern tools allowed them to search not only for exact matches, but also for partial ones. They theorized that relatives of the assailant might be in the database, which could help lead them to the perpetrator. They began their search, and soon focused on one person in the FBI database. His DNA shared common markers with Tanya's perpetrator, but the similarity was quite weak. Police then began to study his family, even contacting the inmate's relatives. They agreed to help investigators, and provided their own DNA samples for comparison. Experts studied their samples and came to a disappointing conclusion. They determined that this family actually had no relation to the suspect, and the detectives were once again left with nothing. In 2018, a journalist named Tony Adame took an interest in the case. Although he didn't specialize in covering criminal cases, he became fascinated by the field, and Tanya's unsolved case caught his attention. He wanted to help solve it, and contacted the investigators responsible for the case. Detectives were somewhat skeptical of his desire to help. Although he was an experienced journalist, Tony had no background in forensics. Nevertheless, the police had no new leads anyway, and they figured he certainly couldn't make things worse. As a result, the journalist effectively joined the investigation and also began communicating with Tanya's family. They saw that the man was genuinely interested in solving the case and was putting significant effort into it. For example, he worked to get the case covered in major media outlets, which brought it additional attention. He also brought a fresh perspective to an investigation that had dragged on for over 30 years, which could also help in solving it. A year later, in 2019, detectives decided to try again to find the perpetrator relatives, but this time they turned to a company called Parabon, which specialized in genetic genealogy. Previously, investigators had only searched for potential relatives through the FBI database, which contained samples from various offenders. Parabon, however, explored public genetic databases, which are much more extensive. Anyone can submit their DNA sample there, for example, to find relatives or learn about their ancestry. Experts got to work and indeed found potential distant relatives of the perpetrator. They began to systematically study their families, building out family trees, and trying to identify someone who would fit their suspect's criteria. They were looking for a man who was old enough in 1985 to commit the crime and who lived in that area. This process took almost a year, as the experts faced an extremely difficult task. In February 2020, they finally zeroed in on a man who could, in theory, be the perpetrator. He was 57-year-old Daniel Wells, who was living in that same city at the time of the events. Detectives looked into his background and found that the man had been on the police radar several times. In the late 80s, he was arrested for assault, and later for public misconduct. As of 2020, Daniel was still living in Pensacola, working as a carpenter. He had a wife and children. Although he fit all the criteria, detectives needed to get a sample of his DNA to compare it directly with the sample from the crime scene. Since they couldn't arrest Daniel without it, the police decided to proceed cautiously. They worried the man might flee if he realized he'd been identified. Police set up surveillance on the suspect. Soon, an opportunity to get his DNA arose. Daniel drove to his workplace and threw a cigarette out of his car window. Investigators stopped, collected the cigarette butt, and immediately sent it to the lab. Experts extracted a DNA sample from the saliva on the filter and compared it to the DNA from the Tanya McKinley crime scene. The result was a perfect match. 35 years later, the police had finally identified the perpetrator, and he was arrested that same day. Even though the investigators had the DNA results, they wanted a confession. For this reason, they decided to be careful and not reveal all their cards to Daniel at once. They sought help from patrol officers and asked them to pull over the suspect's car under the pretext of a routine document check. After that, detectives pulled up and told Daniel he needed to come with them to the station. They didn't tell him what he was being accused of, and the man was visibly nervous, which was their goal. During the interrogation, investigators gradually approached the subject of Tanya's case, asking him questions about where he was that night. Daniel began to deny ever seeing the young woman, and that's when detectives revealed that his DNA was found at the crime scene. The man continued to deny everything, but he grew more nervous with each question. They pointed out that the DNA results were indisputable, and he had no chance of escaping justice. The only thing he could do was to make it easier on himself and confess. At some point, Daniel began to talk. At first, though, he tried to explain the DNA. The man said that perhaps he did know Tanya, and they had an intimate relationship, but the detective said that this version had nothing to do with reality and continued to demand the truth. Finally, Daniel gave in and stated that he did, in fact, end Tanya's life that New Year's night. However, his story immediately raised serious questions. The man confessed that he was at that bar and met Tanya there. She told him she was looking for a ride home, and Daniel offered to help. They got into his car, and the man's subsequent story began to raise doubts. According to him, they drove to his house where they drank and had a consensual, intimate encounter. After that, an argument allegedly broke out between them, the cause of which he couldn't remember. The situation escalated to the point that Daniel grabbed a heavy wooden cutting board and hit Tanya over the head with it in a fit of rage. After that, he realized the girl had lost her life and panicked. Daniel carried her young woman to his car, drove to the spot where she would later be found, and left her there. On the way back, he threw away her belongings and returned home. The man was also asked about the dog hairs found on the victim's clothes and the towel. He replied that his roommate had a black Labrador, and the hairs found were indeed black. Daniel's story sounded as if he was trying to minimize his own responsibility for his actions. First, it was very hard to believe that Tanya would voluntarily engage in intimacy with him, only for them to get into an argument so intense that he would take her life just minutes later. Second, he claimed she passed away from the blow to the head, but medical experts found irrefutable evidence that the cause of death was strangulation. A much more likely version was that Daniel tried to assault Tanya, and she fought back. In the struggle, he hit her over the head, but quickly realized she was still alive, and then caused her asphyxiation. Despite the fact that these details from the suspect's story didn't line up with reality, the detectives had a confession. The man was arrested on charges related to her passing and placed in custody. Immediately after, investigators contacted Tanya's relatives, including her son, and gave them the long-awaited news. Timothy couldn't hold back his emotions and, with tears in his eyes, thanked the police for finally finding the person responsible for his mother's passing. However, Daniel was not destined to stand before a judge or serve time for his actions. Just 2 weeks after his arrest, the man's body was found in his cell. The examination showed that he had passed away by his own hand. Tanya's relatives were distressed by the fact that the perpetrator had escaped the prospect of spending long years in confinement. But ultimately, they still found some measure of peace in knowing that after 35 long years, the case was finally closed. Share your thoughts on this story. I also recommend subscribing to our Telegram channel, where we publish the most interesting crime news from around the world every day, uncensored. Thank you for watching, and take care.